Ancient armies didn't just fight with swords and spears. Some used disease as a weapon, deliberately sending infected animals into enemy lands. Warriors of old crafted arrows dipped not just in poison, but in a horrifying brew of decomposing human remains and venom. Imagine being on a ship, not under attack by cannonballs, but by clay pots filled with slithering venomous snakes hurled at you by your enemies. And one of the most devastating plagues in human history may have gotten a grim boost when attackers launched infected bodies over city walls like biological missiles. Number 7. The Hittites and the curious case of the contagious rams. Way back in the Bronze Age, around the 1320s BCE, the Hittite Empire was a major power in the Middle East, centered in what is now Turkey. They had rivals, of course, and one of them was the Kingdom of Arzawa, located to their west. Wars were common, fought with chariots and bronze weapons. But the Hittites, according to their own ancient records, may have had another, more insidious tactic up their sleeves. Imagine this. You're an Arzawan farmer, and suddenly you see animals, specifically rams, being driven from Hittite territory towards your lands. These aren't healthy, prize-winning animals. There's something off about them. Some historical interpretations suggest these animals were deliberately infected with a disease, possibly something akin to tularemia, a nasty bacterial infection sometimes called rabbit fever. Tularemia can cause fever, skin ulcers, swollen lymph nodes, and pneumonia. It can be spread through contact with infected animals or through insect bites. The Hittite records that hint at this are fascinating and chilling. King Mursili II, who reigned during this period, left behind a series of texts known as the Plague Prayers. In these prayers, Mursili II laments a devastating plague that had been ravaging Hittite lands for decades, a plague he believed was divine punishment. He desperately tries to understand why the gods are angry and what he can do to appease them. Within these prayers, there are mentions of how the plague might have started or spread. Some scholars interpret certain passages to suggest that the Hittites, possibly even before Mursili II's time, had intentionally introduced diseased animals or even infected people into enemy territory, specifically Arzawa, as a way to weaken them during wartime. The idea was simple. If your enemy is sick and dying, they can't fight as effectively. The Plague Prayers describe the dire situation in Hattiland. Hattiland, all of it, is dying. Mursili II cries out to the storm god. He talks about how the plague had been around for 20 years, carried over from his father's reign. He even mentions a specific incident where Hittite troops brought back prisoners from an Egyptian border campaign, and these prisoners carried a plague with them. The Arzawa connection is particularly intriguing for early biological warfare. If the Hittites did indeed send infected rams into Arzawa, it would be one of the earliest recorded instances of a state attempting to use disease as a weapon. The Arzawans, if they encountered these sick animals, might have taken them in, or the disease could have spread to their own livestock and then to the human population. The outcome, as described in general terms for plague victims in Hittite lands, would have been widespread sickness and death, severely hampering Arzawa's ability to resist Hittite expansion or military campaigns. It's important to note that diagnosing diseases from ancient texts is incredibly difficult, and the interpretation of these Hittite records is a subject of ongoing scholarly discussion. However, the texts do strongly suggest an awareness of contagion and the devastating impact of disease, and some readings point towards a deliberate, if crude, attempt to exploit this knowledge for military advantage. The image of diseased rams being herded towards an unsuspecting enemy paints a grim picture of how ancient conflicts were sometimes fought, not just with force of arms, but with the unseen weapons of nature itself. Number 6. Scythian sharpshooters and their septic arrows. The Scythians were a nomadic people who roamed the vast Eurasian steppes from around the 9th century BC to the 1st century CE. They were renowned horsemen and incredibly skilled archers, feared by settled civilizations like the Greeks and Persians. But their arrows weren't just sharp. Ancient writers tell us they were often deliberately made far more lethal through a disgusting and terrifying process. Imagine a Scythian warrior preparing for battle. They wouldn't just sharpen their arrowheads. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, the Scythians had a special recipe for poisoning their arrows. This wasn't a simple plant-based poison. It was a complex, festering concoction designed to ensure that even a minor wound could be fatal. One key ingredient was snake venom, particularly from vipers. But they didn't stop there. Herodotus describes how they would mix the venom with human blood and bury it in dung heaps or a sealed container until it putrefied. Other accounts, like that of the Roman writer Pliny the Elder, mention Scythians dipping their arrowheads into a mixture of viper venom and decomposed human corpses, or even just letting the blood and serum from the vipers putrefy. The Greek geographer Strabo, writing around the turn of the 1st millennium, also confirmed the Scythian practice of poisoning arrows with viper venom and human blood, noting the deadly effects of the wounds they inflicted. The idea was to create a septic arrow. The rotting organic matter, blood, bits of flesh, feces, would be teeming with bacteria. When an arrow coated in this vile brew pierced an enemy's skin, it wouldn't just cause a puncture wound. It would introduce a host of dangerous microorganisms deep into the tissue. The venom itself would cause pain, swelling, and tissue damage, but the real horror came from the infection that almost inevitably followed. Wounds inflicted by these arrows would quickly become inflamed, swollen, and filled with pus. Severs would set in. Without modern antibiotics, such infections could easily lead to gangrene, with the tissue dies and rots, or sepsis, a life-threatening condition where the body's response to infection damages its own tissues and organs. Death, if it came, would often be slow and agonizing. Even if the initial wound wasn't in a vital spot, the poison and infection could do the job. This practice wasn't just about killing. It was also about psychological warfare. The Scythians were known for their ferocity, and the knowledge that their arrows carried such a horrific payload would have struck terror into the hearts of their enemies. The fear of a lingering, painful death from a minor scratch would have been a powerful deterrent and a demoralizing factor in battle. The Scythians were masters of hit and run tactics, relying on their mobility and archery. Their poisoned arrows made their ranged attacks even more devastating. They didn't need to kill an enemy outright with a single shot. A graze could be enough to take a soldier out of commission permanently. This gruesome practice highlights the brutal realities of ancient warfare, where any advantage, no matter how horrific, might be sought to ensure victory or survival on the harsh steppes. Their reputation as formidable and terrifying foes was in part earned through this deliberate and macabre weaponization of decay and venom. Number 5. Solon's siege secret. The river that ran with madness. Around 600 BC, long before the Golden Age of Athens, a conflict known as the First Sacred War erupted in Greece. On one side was the city of Kirrha, sometimes spelled Crissa, a port town near the sacred site of Delphi. On the other was the Amphictyonic League, a coalition of Greek city-states that included Athens, tasked with protecting Delphi. Kirrha was accused of robbing pilgrims, heading to the Oracle of Delphi, and encroaching on sacred land. So the League decided to lay siege to the city. The siege dragged on. Kirrha was well fortified and had a reliable water supply from the River Pleistus, which flowed through or near the city. The attackers, among whom was the famed Athenian statesman and poet Solon, were getting frustrated. They needed a way to break the stalemate. according to several ancient sources, including the Greek travel writer Pausanias, 2nd century CE, and the Roman military writer Frontinus, 1st century CE. Solon came up with a cunning and rather nasty plan. He decided to target Kirrha's water. But not just by cutting it off. He decided to poison it. The chosen poison was hellebore, a plant known for its potent medicinal and toxic properties. There are different types of hellebore, but species like Helleborus niger, Christmas rose, or Veratrum album, white hellebore, which grew in the region, contain powerful alkaloids. In small doses, hellebore was used in ancient medicine as a purgative to induce vomiting, but in larger quantities it's a dangerous poison. It can cause severe gastrointestinal distress, think violent diarrhea, and vomiting, as well as cramping, delirium, convulsions, and cardiac problems. Could literally make people sick to their stomachs and minds. Solon's alleged plan was to divert the course of the River Pleistus for a time, cutting off Kirrha's water. Then he had his men gather large quantities of hellebore roots. These roots were thrown into the riverbed upstream from Kirrha. After a sufficient amount of the plant had contaminated the remaining water, or the riverbed itself, the Athenians allowed the river to return to its original course, flowing back towards the besieged city. The thirsty defenders of Kirrha, overjoyed to see their water supply restored, drank deeply from the river. The effects, as described by ancient writers, were devastating. Soon, the Kirrhans were overcome with extreme and uncontrollable diarrhea. They became so weakened and incapacitated by the constant, debilitating sickness that they were unable to man the city walls or offer any effective resistance. With the defenders physically wrecked and demoralized, the forces of the Amphictyonic League found it much easier to storm the city. Kirrha fell, and the League exacted a harsh punishment, destroying the city and dedicating its land to Apollo. The story of Solon and the poisoning of Kirrha's water supply with hellebore is a stark example of how ancient sieges weren't always won by brute force. Clever, and often cruel, tactics were employed. While some modern historians express skepticism about the details or even the historicity of this specific event, it was widely reported in antiquity. Pausanias even claimed that this act of poisoning the water led to a divine curse on Solon's descendants. Whether entirely factual or a cautionary tale that grew over time, it reflects an ancient understanding of toxicology and a willingness to use it as a weapon when conventional methods fail, turning a life-giving river into a source of misery and defeat. Number 4. Hannibal's naval nasty. Snakes on a ship. Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginian general, famous for crossing the Alps with elephants to fight Rome, was one of history's most brilliant military minds. Even after Carthage's defeat in the Second Punic War, Hannibal continued to be a thorn in Rome's side, offering his expertise to other kingdoms hostile to the expanding Roman Republic. Around 184 BC, Hannibal found himself serving King Prusias, the first of Bithynia, a kingdom in northwestern Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. Prusias was at war with Eumenes II, the king of Pergamum, who happened to be a staunch ally of Rome. A naval battle was looming between the Bithynian and Pergamene fleets. Pergamon fleet was larger and more experienced, so Hannibal knew he needed an unconventional strategy to level the playing field. He came up with something truly inventive and terrifying: biological warfare at sea, using snakes, according to the Roman biographer Cornelius Nepos, who wrote Life of Hannibal. In the 1st century BC, Hannibal ordered his men to gather a large number of venomous snakes. These weren't just any snakes. They were the most poisonous ones they could find. Once collected, the snakes were stuffed into earthenware pots or jars. Hundreds, Perhaps thousands of these writhing, agitated reptiles were sealed inside these fragile containers. When the naval battle commenced, the Bithynian ships, under Hannibal's direction, made a peculiar move. Instead of engaging in conventional ramming or boarding tactics, immediately they focused on Eumenes' flagship. Then, on Hannibal's signal, his soldiers began launching these earthenware pots filled with snakes onto the decks of the Pergamon ships, particularly targeting the enemy flagship. Imagine the scene: clay pots shattering on the wooden decks, and out slithered dozens of angry, venomous snakes. Pergamene sailors, expecting perhaps rocks or flaming projectiles, were suddenly faced with a deck crawling with deadly reptiles. Panic ensued. Sailors would have been scrambling to avoid being bitten, their attention completely diverted from fighting the enemy. Chaos and fear would have been immense. Trying to fight off human attackers while dodging striking vipers is a nearly impossible task. Cornelius Nepos records that, at first, the Pergamene sailors laughed at this strange tactic, thinking the Bithynians were foolishly throwing clay pots, but when they saw the snakes emerge, their amusement quickly turned to terror. The morale of the Pergamene crews plummeted. Even if not everyone was bitten, the presence of the snakes made organized defense or attack chaotic and difficult. Hannibal's forces pressed their advantage. With the enemy crews in disarray, distracted and horrified by the serpentine assault, the Bithynian ships were able to attack more effectively. According to Nepos, this bizarre tactic was instrumental in securing victory for Prusias's fleet. Eumenes II himself was reportedly forced to withdraw his flagship from the battle due to the snake attack. Pliny the Elder, another Roman writer from the 1st century CE, also mentions this incident in his Natural History, confirming the use of pots filled with snakes. His snake bomb strategy is a testament to Hannibal's ingenuity and his willingness to use psychological shock and unconventional weapons to overcome a superior foe. It was a horrifyingly effective way to disrupt enemy formations and morale, turning the tide of a naval battle with one of nature's most feared creatures. It remains one of the most unusual and striking examples of biological warfare in the ancient world. Number 3. The Assyrian appetite for ruin. Was it fungal fright? The Neo-Assyrian Empire, which dominated the Middle East from roughly 911 BCE to 609 BCE, was known for its military might, its sophisticated siegecraft, and, frankly, its extreme brutality. Assyrian kings often boasted in their inscriptions about the gruesome fates they inflicted upon conquered peoples. They were masters of psychological warfare, aiming to terrify enemies into submission. Given this reputation, some historians and researchers have explored the possibility that the Assyrians might have also employed subtle biological means to weaken their foes, particularly during their infamous sieges. One intriguing, though more speculative candidate for an Assyrian biological weapon is rye ergot. Ergot is a fungus, Claviceps purpurea, that can infect rye and other grains. When humans consume grain contaminated with ergot, they can suffer from a devastating condition called ergotism. Ergotism has two main forms, convulsive and gangrenous. Convulsive ergotism attacks the nervous system, leading to muscle spasms, twitching, seizures, hallucinations, and mania. People might feel like they were crawling with insects or burning from within. Gangrenous ergotism, historically known as St. Anthony's fire or holy fire, affects the blood vessels, restricting blood flow to the extremities. This causes an intense burning sensation in the limbs, followed by dry gangrene, where fingers, toes, and even entire limbs could shrivel, blacken, and fall off, often without any blood loss. Both forms were agonizing and often fatal. The Assyrians, were meticulous record keepers and had a sophisticated understanding of agriculture and administration. It's plausible they were aware of the effects of spoiled or contaminated grain. Question is whether they deliberately used this knowledge. While direct textual evidence of Assyrians intentionally poisoning enemy grain supplies with ergot is scarce or debated, their known cruelty and advanced siege tactics make it a possibility that scholars consider. Imagine a city under Assyrian siege. The walls are strong, but food and water are dwindling. If Assyrian agents, or even Assyrian forces during a temporary retreat or feint, managed to contaminate the enemy's grain stores with ergot-infected rye, the consequences within the city would be horrific. People would start to fall ill with bizarre and terrifying symptoms. Some might go mad, writhing in convulsions. Others might watch in horror as their limbs turned black and useless. This would not only physically incapacitate the defenders, but also shatter their morale, making them believe they were cursed or divinely punished. The Assyrians were known to poison wells, so contaminating food supplies wouldn't be a far stretch. The effects of ergotism were well documented in later periods, such as the Middle Ages in Europe, where outbreaks caused widespread suffering. If the Assyrians understood the link between the fungus and the disease, even imperfectly, it would have been a terrifyingly effective weapon to use against a starving, besieged population. While we lack a smoking gun inscription saying, "We fed them the cursed grain," the circumstantial evidence, Assyrian ruthlessness, their knowledge of poisons for wells, their sophisticated siegecraft, and the known devastating effects of ergotism has led some to propose that this fungus might have been part of their arsenal. It remains a chilling possibility that adds another layer to the Assyrians' fearsome reputation as masters of warfare, both overt and potentially covert. The very idea of an enemy deliberately introducing such a horrifying, invisible sickness is the stuff of nightmares. Number 2. Roman realpolitik, when wells wept poison. The Roman military machine was legendary for its discipline, engineering prowess, and adaptability. Roman legions conquered vast territories, and a key part of their success was their mastery of siege warfare. When facing a fortified city that wouldn't surrender, Romans employed a variety of tactics, from building massive siege engines to constructing extensive earthworks. But sometimes they resorted to more insidious methods, particularly targeting a city's most vital resource, water. Poisoning enemy water supplies was a known, if grim, tactic in the ancient world, and the Romans were certainly aware of it. The Roman military writer, the Decius, in his influential 4th century CE work De Re Militari, concerning military matters, discusses various aspects of warfare, including the importance of securing one's own water supply and contaminating the enemy's. He explicitly mentions poisoning wells with corrupting substances as a way to harm an adversary, while specific, well-documented instances of Romans successfully using widespread biological contamination of water to win a siege are sometimes hard to pin down with absolute certainty for earlier periods. The principle was understood and occasionally attempted or feared. The methods could be quite crude, but effective. One common approach was to throw animal carcasses into wells, springs, or cisterns within a besieged city. A rotting animal carcass would quickly foul the water, introducing bacteria like E. coli or Salmonella, which could cause severe dysentery, typhoid fever, and other debilitating gastrointestinal illnesses. Human corpses were also reportedly used in this manner, adding a psychological horror element to the physical threat. Beyond carcasses, Romans and their adversaries might use various poisonous plants or minerals if available. The goal was not always to kill outright with a fast-acting toxin, but often to sicken and weaken the population, making them less able to resist an assault or endure a prolonged siege. Widespread illness would strain resources, lower morale, and reduce the number of effective fighters. There are accounts where Romans themselves were victims of such tactics. For example, during Emperor Septimius Severus's siege of the city of Hatra in Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, in 198 CE, the Roman historian Cassius Dio records that the defenders of Hatra caused significant problems for the Roman army. While not explicitly detailing biological agents in wells for this specific siege, he notes the Romans suffered from disease and lack of wholesome water, and the Hatrinis used various noxious substances against them, including earthenware jars full of poisonous insects thrown at the attackers. It's plausible that the poisoning of water sources accessible to the besieging Roman army was also a tactic employed by defenders. Frontinus, in his work Stratagems from the late 1st century CE, also collected various military tricks and ruses, some of which involved water sources. While he doesn't focus heavily on biological contamination, the broader context shows that manipulating water was a key part of siegecraft. The use of such methods reflects the brutal pragmatism or realpolitik that often characterized Roman warfare. If a city wouldn't yield, and a lengthy siege was costly in terms of time, resources, and Roman lives, any method that could hasten its fall might be considered. Contaminating water was a way to attack the entire population, soldiers and civilians alike, from within, breaking their will to resist through sickness and despair. It was a grim but recognized part of the ancient art of war, a reminder that the fight for survival often pushed combatants to use every tool at their disposal, no matter how unsavory. Number 1. The Black Death's Launchpad, Catapulting Courses at Kaffa. This is perhaps one of the most infamous and widely cited examples of biological warfare in pre-modern history, and it's linked to one of the deadliest pandemics humanity has ever faced, the Black Death. The year was 1346. The place was Kaffa, now Feodosia, a thriving Genoese trading port on the Crimean Peninsula on the Black Sea. The city found itself under siege by the Mongol forces of the Golden Horde, led by Khan Janibeg. The siege was tough, and the Mongol army, like many armies throughout history, began to suffer from a devastating disease that was sweeping through their ranks. This disease was characterized by fever, chills, vomiting, diarrhea, and painful swollen lymph nodes, called buboes, the telltale signs of bubonic plague. Soldiers were dying in droves. What happened next? According to a contemporary account by an Italian notary named Gabriele de Mussi, was horrifyingly ingenious and utterly ruthless. De Mussi, who was from Piacenza and likely heard accounts from Genoese survivors or merchants, wrote that the Mongols, frustrated by the siege and decimated by the plague, decided to use their dead as weapons. They loaded the plague-infected corpses of their fallen soldiers onto their siege engines, massive catapults or trebuchets. Then they began to hurl these disease-ridden bodies over the city walls and into the besieged city of Kaffa. Imagine the terror and disgust of the people inside Kaffa as human corpses, dead from a terrifying and contagious illness, rained down upon them. De Mussi wrote, "They ordered corpses to be placed in catapults and lobbed into the city in hopes that the intolerable stench would kill everyone within." He described how the air became thick with the smell of death, and how the defenders were overwhelmed by the sight and the implications. The Genoese defenders couldn't simply ignore the bodies. They tried to dispose of them by throwing them into the sea, but the sheer number was overwhelming. According to de Mussi's account, the disease soon took hold within the city walls. Soon the rotting corpses tainted the air and poisoned the water supply, and the stench was so overwhelming that hardly one in several thousand was in a position to flee the remains of the Tartar army. He wrote, "Although the primary transmission of bubonic plague is through flea bites, not necessarily stench or direct contact with corpses, though fleas could leave the corpses. Regardless of the exact transmission dynamics understood at the time, the outcome was a devastating outbreak of plague inside Kaffa." The siege eventually ended, possibly due to the Mongols' own losses to the plague or other factors. Some Genoese merchants and citizens managed to escape Kaffa by ship, fleeing the pestilence-ridden city. Dumussi's narrative strongly implies that these fleeing ships carried the plague with them. He describes how ships from Kaffa arrived in ports like Constantinople, Sicily, Genoa, and Venice, and how the plague then erupted in these locations, spreading like wildfire across Europe. This catapulting of plague corpses at Kaffa is often cited as a key moment in the transmission of the Black Death from the East into Europe, which would go on to kill an estimated 30% to 60% of Europe's population between 1347 and 1351, while some modern historians debate the precise impact of the Kaffa incident on the overall spread of the Black Death, arguing that the plague was likely spreading along multiple trade routes already. Dumussi's account remains a powerful contemporary testimony to an act of what appears to be intentional biological warfare. It vividly illustrates the desperation and brutality of siege warfare in the 14th century and provides a chilling example of how disease, whether fully understood or not, could be weaponized with devastating consequences. The image of plague-infected bodies being used as gruesome projectiles is a stark reminder of the lengths to which combatants might go in times of conflict.